I'm getting my hands dirty on this beautiful mid-March spring day here in Zone 6B. I am amending the soil in my container beds. It's a very time-consuming task. It's probably the thing that takes the longest every growing season, and it is somewhat physically demanding, which I'm going to show you kind of what that looks like. So today I'm going to first talk you through the products that I'm going to use to amend the soil, and then I'm going to show you my process for how I do it in these different container beds. Let's get going. So there are 3 products that I use to amend my soil, and the first of those is going to be coconut coir, and they typically come like this in a block, and then you're going to hydrate them, and then they're going to get all crumbly like that. What this is it's going to help retain moisture in your garden beds. This is especially important in those hot summer months when your tomatoes and peppers are really kind of struggling through those, at least here in the Midwest. Sometimes we get up into the 100-degree days. And so when you have something in your soil that's going to help retain the moisture, those plants are going to do a lot better. And so that is the purpose of the coco coir. Now, some people also use peat moss. There's a bit of a debate in the gardening community about which one is better. So do your research and decide for yourself what you want to use. But I use the coco coir. I find it just really easy. The second thing I'm going to add is vermiculite. So you can use either vermiculite or perlite. They both do the same thing, which is to loosen up the soil. That's really important as you're amending the soil from the previous growing season because the soil is going to have some roots in it. I've noticed as I dig into the bottom of my containers that the soil on the bottom after a growing season of watering, it gets really compact and like the sand and kind of the smaller particles get down to the bottom. And so going through and kind of churning that up and adding something like a vermiculite or a perlite is going to really loosen that soil. And that's really important because your plant roots, those plants are going to do better if the roots can go deep into your containers. And so if the bottom layer is really compact, it's going to be harder for them to do that. So 1, going through and churning up the soil, which is a little physically demanding, but then 2, adding in the coco coir and the vermiculite is going to help loosen that up. And then lastly, I'm going to add in compost. And this is arguably the most important of the 3 items. And that is because the compost is where you get your nutrients. And vegetable plants are very heavy feeders. They need a lot of nutrients. And so I add compost at the beginning of the year when I amend my soil, but then I also do it throughout the season. Now, I use a few different types of compost. This one right here in my hand is going to be mushroom compost. But I do a few different types of compost because your vegetables are going to thrive if they have a variety of micronutrients, and different composts are going to have different nutrient profiles. So I really like the mushroom compost. It's organic, it's light. It also kind of acts as a soil loosener. But I've had really great success using this the last couple of years. And I'm going to add this with some worm castings, and then I will also do cotton burr compost. And again, this is just because the more variety of compost that you're adding in, the more different types of nutrients. And that's really going to help your vegetable plants to thrive, at least in my experience. So each spring, I like to replace about 1/3 of the soil in each of my containers with coconut coir, vermiculite, and compost. Now, in addition to adding those to the soil, what is really important is that you are actually going through the container. You're taking out any root balls from the previous growing season. You're looking for grubs to get out of there, and you're just loosening up that compacted soil. You're going to see today as I'm doing this, but what I notice is that as you really get down in there, the soil, because you're watering throughout the previous growing season, the smaller particles are moving to the bottom of that container, and it gets really compact down there. And it's really important for your new plants that their roots are able to get to the bottom of the container and really establish those healthy, deep root systems. And they can't do that if they can't get down there because the soil is going to be so compacted. So today, as I'm going through here, I'm really going to be churning up that soil. And I will say, as a new gardener, I mostly made the mistake those first few years of just kind of worrying about like the top layer, the top half of that soil. So I'd always go in with my compost and amendment. I felt really good about that. But then as the years went on, I just realized how much you really need to just take care of the whole container every season. And it is time consuming. It is somewhat physically demanding, but it is really the best way to get a good start to the growing season. And this is going to be the thing that you spend the most time on throughout the growing season. This process, I set aside a half day, sometimes longer, to really go through and amend my container beds. But like I said, it's worth it, and it's something that you're going to want to do. So looking at this, I do have some twigs, which I'll put in my leaf bag, but all of these leaves, I'm actually going to be leaving in here and just kind of like crunch them up and add them into the soil more as I'm going. So these beds, after the fall growing season was over, I just left them. And so everything that's in here is just kind of been, adding onto over the winter. And so the leaves are going to stay because leaves are actually nature's original compost. These days, us gardeners, we spend so much time buying the nice fertilizers and the compost. But before, there were gardeners to do that, and nature was just kind of regrowing every year on its own. Leaves were really what was used as the compost. And that, makes sense if you think about like the natural cycle of the seasons. The leaves fall off, they go on the ground, they create beautiful compost, put beautiful nutrients into that soil. And so then you can regrow things come spring. So we're going to leave those leaves in there. So I'm going through, I'm kind of breaking up any soil that has gathered together, and I'm going to remove about a third of the soil from this container, and I will then put it back in once I've added those products to amend it. So take out some soil. Also, by taking out this soil, I'm going to be able to then get to the bottom of this container as well. And again, as I'm going through here, I'm just kind of looking for things I can take out, whether it's root balls or grubs. Those little white larvae, those belong to beetles, and those are not friends of the garden. So we take those out. Now, there's not many root balls I'm finding in this one, but there were some in the other container, so I'll show you what those looked like. You really want to make sure you're getting those root balls out, because if you have a lot of those in your container, then the new plants that you're planting, it's going to be harder for those roots to really get down. They're going to stop when they hit those root balls. So I've taken out about a third, maybe a little more actually, of the container and put it in my tub for later when I'm going to add it back in with those other things. And what I'm observing right now is I'm not even probably halfway down the container, and this soil is already really compacted. I mean, it is hard for me using the strength of my arms to really get in there and break up that soil. And so, imagine these little fragile plant roots, they're really going to struggle to get through that. And so that's why it's so important. Like I said, as a beginning gardener in the past, I would really just focus on the soil, honestly, probably from this level up, and I'd, churn it and amend it, and I would totally leave the rest of the soil underneath it. And I would wonder why my plants wouldn't get very big. Well, it's because those roots aren't able to develop underneath. And so it's just really important to be going through here and loosening that. And again, it is a little physically demanding. I'm obviously using my hands. You can use tools if you want, if that's easier for you. Whatever you got to do to really get in the bottom here. Oh, here's some leftover from my little seed starters. I'll get rid of those. I finally made it to the bottom of the container, so now at this point I'm just doing the best I can to keep loosening that up. Feel pretty good about that for now, so I'm going to call this one good. Once I do have my mixture of the coir, the vermiculite, and the compost, I'll go in and do the same thing once I add a third of that mixture to this container. So I'll really go in and churn it and do as best as I can to get that coir, especially in the vermiculite, down to the bottom, so that it can really continue loosening up that soil. So like I said, time consuming, it's a little bit physically demanding. Use tools if you need to make it easier for you. But I'm going to do this to all of the other containers that I have here on my deck. And then I do have a container in the front of my house as well. And then some down below on my patio. So I'm going to do that to all these, and I will next show you how I add those things back in.
So I way underestimated how much the coconut coir would expand, and it actually has taken up the whole tub. So my original plan and what I normally do is I fill the tub about equal parts of coconut coir, vermiculite, and compost. But since the entire tub has been filled with the coconut coir, what I'm going to have to do is just fill into the containers about the same amount of each of those three items. So rather than mix them all up and create kind of one product that I'm putting into the container, I'm going to have to put them all separate and just eye them and do my best to get them as equal as possible. So that's what I'll do next.
It took me about 2 days, but I am finally finished with preparing my container gardens for the spring season. So in each container, I have both transplants and seeds that have not sprouted up yet. These containers are about 6 years old, but they've held up pretty well. In addition to amending the soil, I also went through and cleaned the containers up as much as I could.